This question of the dichotomy between the older generation and the newer generation, because I find it really fascinating. Irving Kristol, writing back in the late 70s and very early 80s, was basically saying this whole notion that America can breed democracies around the world is utterly ridiculous. It's silly. In fact, he said it's not something we should have any concern about. Getting back to Fukuyama's essay, in the counter-essays that ran in National Interest, his, I think, was probably the most penetrating and dismissive of any of those essays that were written at that time. And now, today, you've got a Robert Kagan who basically says, as he wrote in that little book about U.S.-European relations, Francis Fukuyama basically got it right. So that's a tremendous dichotomy, and I gather what you're saying is that it's a kind of a box canyon to try to figure out what the influence of the younger generation has been on the older generation. When Irving Kristol wrote that piece in the Weekly Standard about trying to explain what neoconservatism is, he just brushes over all of this stuff and doesn't, as if it doesn't matter. If in fact it doesn't matter, and if in fact it's a Kagan influence on William Kristol, what does that say about neoconservatism? I mean, is there even such a thing as neoconservatism if it wispily moves from one thing to another, from one generation to the next, and yet they all continue to call themselves of the same stripe?
Well, yes, that's why I try to argue in the book that it's not an ideology but a mindset. I would argue that the way Bill Kristol approaches issues rhetorically and strategically, that is, how is this issue going to hurt the liberals? And the questioning of people's motives and strident language, all of that, I think, is the heritage from the parents. It doesn't mean that they have to adopt all of the same views, that they do essentially share the same views on domestic policy. But in foreign policy, as I try to say, I think the younger generation lack the sense of irony and sense of history that the older generation had experienced. Jeane Kirkpatrick, for example, was not gung-ho to invade Iraq. She was more of a realist. So was Irving Kristol. But they are still separated from the Republican Party. It's what I say in the Grover's right. What I say in the beginning of the book is, for the liberal hawks, the rightists, the New Republic aren't really any different from the neoconservatives. But they all have, and the neoconservatives have this less today, the younger generation, but they have an aesthetic revulsion for the Republican Party. It's as simple as that. They don't want to call themselves conservatives or Republicans. Those are the bad people, the people that you don't want to associate with. And they feel, then they also like to have the feeling of being, again, of being elitist and above the fray and having special wisdom. And those qualities, I think, define to a large extent what neoconservatism has become.
Wayne.
Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. I'd like to ask you to say a few words about the neoliberals, because not so many years ago we had a Democratic administration and a foreign policy team who shared a lot of characteristics that you have described of this group in their attitudes towards Russia, towards the Balkans, even towards Iraq and Iran. And we may again in the not distant future. Could you say how you see the neo-libs fundamentally being distinguished in their worldview and in their attitudes towards America's role in it from the neocons?
I think the neoliberals do share some culpability for the hubris that emerged after the Cold War. I don't have as dour a view of Clinton's foreign policy as a lot of people do. I actually think even though he did deploy military power, I'm not sure they really had it in their stomachs to go as far as Bush did. I guess that would be I think rhetorically, and there's very little difference in many ways between neoliberals and neoconservatives. I mean, there was certainly an alliance on the issue of Bosnia in the 1990s. But I don't think that I guess the neoliberals wouldn't be as unilateralist, too. That's a big theme among the neocons. Irving Kristol was a unilateralist. I mean, he was calling for pulling out of NATO in the 1950s. They don't want any restrictions on American power. I think there are the issue of the United Nations. I think the neoliberals are much more sympathetic to that.
Peter, you want to say something?
Yeah, if you'd like me to, Dmitry.
And you will be the last. Peter Rosenblatt, Ambassador Rosenblatt is former president of the Coalition for Democratic Majority, and you were close to some of the heroes of Jacob's book, but I should say without necessarily sharing their temper.
Well, I think this is a matter of history. I must say, with respect to the time when we were all Democrats, and that lasted until 1980, I think we shared a lot of viewpoints on foreign policy. We didn't attempt to get into other aspects of government policy, certainly not economics, or many other areas. But the two names that resounded when we were Democrats were McGovern and Scoop Jackson. Those are two names you didn't mention in your original presentation. Both Democrats, both polar opposites from one another. And our disagreements concerned foreign policy, and those disagreements were with the dominant elements of the Democratic Party of the time. I did not hear any discussion of the Holocaust as a motivating factor. In fact, where it comes to the Jewish aspect of this thing, in our internal discussions in CDM, the loudest, strongest, and most persistent pro-Israel voice was Jeane Kirkpatrick's. And Jeane, apropos of what happened to those who then called themselves neoconservatives after 1980, Jeane once said to me, and I guess I can say it now that she's gone, when I asked her after she became a Republican how she could become a Republican given Republican domestic policy, she said, if they knew what my views were on domestic policy, they'd throw me out of the Republican Party. That's about all I want to say right now.
Your response.
I guess I knew Jeane Kirkpatrick quite well, too. And two quick points. I think what I tried to argue in the book is it's not exclusively the Holocaust, but that the Holocaust forms a backdrop for opposing totalitarianism more generally. And that is, and my second point would be from my conversations with Jeane Kirkpatrick, I think she was also motivated by that memory as well. Not that she was had a personal stake in it, but I think that was one of the driving forces in her opposition to totalitarianism. She did take, exactly as you say, a very, very pro-Israel stance, but it wasn't just pro-Israel. I mean, I think, again, the experience of studying totalitarianism at Columbia after World War II, and she also studied with Franz Neumann, who is a famous, who was himself a refugee from Nazi Germany, and wrote this book called The Behemoth, which is a classic study of the Nazi bureaucratic state. So I think, I'm not trying to, I think maybe we're getting a little too reductionist here, or maybe that's my fault in the presentation. I'm not trying to argue that people are blindly driven by the Holocaust, but that it is a moving force in helping to shape the mental world and fueling opposition to tyranny and to totalitarianism around the globe, and that it has been for many decades, not just for neoconservatives, but also for liberals, hence our great espoused interest in stopping genocide. I mean, I think, again, it's the memory of the Holocaust and the failure of the Roosevelt administration really to try and do anything.
Jacob, thank you very much. Thank you, Grover. Thank you, Doc, for a very interesting discussion. I kind of encouraged to hear that the neocons are a small and elitist group, and that the president, not the neocons, make decisions. I do remember there was a country called Russia, where a small elitist group of public intellectuals, contrary to everybody's expectations, came to power. That country was called the Soviet Union. I also do remember that there was a split among the Bolsheviks. And one part of the Bolsheviks, called the Trotskyites, was a utopian messianic cult with global ambitions, for whom Russia was essentially an instrument to remake the universe. When a group like that has an impact on American politics, when people who share this mindset become advisors to presidents, there is something to think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you.